In the year 1492, the kingdoms that would become Spain stood at a hinge of history. For generations, the Iberian Peninsula had been divided among Christian realms and Muslim states. Its politics shaped by border war, raids, truces, and sudden shifts of fortune. Now, through the dynastic union of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the largest Christian crowns were bound together. They were not yet a single centralized nation, but they could act with a new unity, pooling resources, coordinating policy, and projecting power with greater confidence than any one kingdom could manage alone. That same year, the long Reconquista reached its symbolic conclusion. Granada, the last Muslim kingdom on the peninsula, fell after a sustained campaign. The victory carried more than military meaning. It strengthened the idea that monarchy and Catholic identity belonged to the same project. To rule was to defend and extend the faith, and to build the state was to impose religious and political order. The Crown's authority tightened around institutions, taxation, and law, and it sought legitimacy not only through lineage and conquest, but through a sacred mission. With the peninsula's great war winding down, Spain faced a question shared by every ambitious power in Europe. Where would wealth and influence come from next? The Mediterranean was contested, and the richest trade, spices, silks, gold, flowed through routes controlled by rivals and intermediaries. Portugal had been pushing down the coast of Africa, building experience in navigation and fortification, and seeking a sea road to Asia. If Portugal could reach the Indian Ocean first, it could dominate the most profitable commerce of the age. Spain needed another path, something that could match Portugal's promise of trade, while also fitting Spain's crusading momentum and hunger for prestige. That opening arrived in the form of an audacious proposal. Christopher Columbus argued that by sailing west across the Atlantic, he could reach the markets of Asia faster than any voyage around Africa. The idea relied on mistaken calculations, but it appealed to the moment, a newly confident monarchy fresh from victory, looking for a grand venture that could bring bullion, ports, and souls to convert. In 1492, Columbus sailed. The immediate results were confusing and electrifying: new islands, unfamiliar peoples, and the belief that the edges of Asia were close at hand. Early expectations hardened quickly. There would be gold to find, labour to command, rivals to keep out, and a Christian duty to claim and baptize. The Crown saw an opportunity not merely for exploration, but for sovereignty. New lands to govern, new revenues to fund war and display power, and new realms to add to a growing Catholic monarchy. From this westward gamble, an empire would take shape, first tentative and improvised, then vast and systematized, and eventually strained beyond what its wealth could sustain. The story begins in 1492, and it will unfold across 4 centuries, to 1898, as Spain rises into a global empire, and then, step by step, loses it. Columbus's first landfalls brought Spain into the Caribbean as an uncertain newcomer, but the logic of empire took hold quickly. The islands were close enough to resupply, sheltered enough for anchorage, and populated by communities who could be pressed, by persuasion or force, into feeding expeditions and guiding them onward. What began as exploration turned into a search for something more specific: gold that could be carried home, authority that could be claimed before rivals arrived, and a stable base from which Spain could keep sailing. On Hispaniola, the first foothold hardened into the first colony. Columbus's men built a small fort and then a town, and very soon they discovered the problem that would define Spain's early Caribbean. Europeans came in numbers expecting sudden wealth, but the local economy was not organized to deliver it. There were no great storehouses of treasure waiting to be taken. Gold existed, but in small amounts, gathered from streams and traded regionally. To extract it at a scale that satisfied investors and the Crown, the Spaniards demanded labour. Those demands reshaped daily life on the island with brutal speed. Spanish settlements needed food, construction, and transport, and they also needed indigenous labour for mining. The earliest system was improvised. Tribute requirements, forced carrying, and compulsory work imposed through local leaders pressured into compliance. When that failed, coercion escalated. Raids, punishments, hostage-taking, and wars framed as pacification. Violence was not only a tool of conquest, it was a way to keep an unstable colony fed and producing. For the indigenous communities of Hispaniola, the consequences were catastrophic. People were pulled from their villages for work far from home. Food production faltered as fields were neglected and social structures strained under constant exaction. Resistance took many forms: flight into less accessible regions, refusal to comply, attacks on outposts, but Spanish weaponry, horses, and trained tactics made open conflict terribly costly. Yet even Spanish victory did not solve the deeper problem. The settlers kept arriving, and their survival depended on labour the island could not provide without breaking. The Spanish response was to turn coercion into something that looked like administration. Out of early tribute demands and labour drafts emerged the roots of the encomienda, a grant by which a Spaniard received the right to collect tribute and labour from a specific indigenous community, in exchange for a promised duty to protect them and instruct them in Christianity. In theory, it bound conquest to responsibility. In practice, it tied wealth to extraction and gave local Spaniards enormous leverage over people who were now compelled to sustain a foreign colony. This system was not created fully formed in a single decree. It developed through argument, compromise, and the simple fact that colonists refused to go hungry or return home empty-handed. The Crown wanted revenue and control, but it also feared lawless adventurers building private fiefdoms across the ocean. So, from the start, Spanish Caribbean rule carried attention. Colonists on the ground demanded autonomy and rewards, while royal officials tried to channel conquest into predictable taxable patterns. Then disease accelerated everything. Old world pathogens, especially smallpox, but also measles and influenza, moved faster than Spanish paperwork and faster than Spanish swords. Caribbean populations had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. Epidemics arrived in waves, and each wave reduced communities already weakened by forced labour, hunger, displacement and war. The demographic collapse was not a single event, but a long unravelling, and it reshaped the Spanish project at its foundation. As the indigenous population of Hispaniola fell sharply, the colony's labour demands did not disappear, they intensified. Spaniards tried to pull people from other islands, extending raiding and slaving outward in search of workers. The logic was grimly circular. Labour shortages produced more coercion, which produced more death and flight, which produced deeper shortages. The Crown's desire for gold and settlement collided with the biological reality that the Caribbean was becoming a graveyard. Cuba became the next major step in this expansion, both because of its size and because Hispaniola's early settlements needed new sources of food, labour and opportunity. Spanish expeditions moved into Cuba in the 1510s, establishing towns that served as military posts, administrative hubs, and bases for further voyages. The pattern repeated: alliances and negotiations where possible, violence where resistance was strong, and then the imposition of tribute and labour on surviving communities. Cuba's ports, timber and farmland made it valuable even when gold was limited, and its location made it ideal for staging expeditions westward. By this time, the Caribbean was no longer a vague discovery. It was becoming a working imperial space, towns with councils, officials who claimed to represent royal authority, and settlers who expected legal recognition of their spoils. Ships began to move along familiar routes. Supplies were organised. Horses, weapons and manpower could be gathered. then launched toward the next target. The islands were Spain's training ground, where conquistadors learned the tactics of intimidation and negotiation, and where administrators learned, often painfully, what it cost to govern across an ocean. The Church entered this world as both partner and critic. Missionary efforts aimed at conversion gave conquest a spiritual rationale, and baptisms became a way to fold indigenous peoples into a Christian empire. But religious orders and some clergy also witnessed the realities of forced labour and mass death, and they brought moral pressure into a system that otherwise rewarded extraction. The question was not abstract. If indigenous people were rational souls capable of Christian faith, then what limits should exist on Spanish power over them? These early debates reached the crown because the monarchy needed to define legitimacy. Spain claimed its right to rule through discovery, papal authority, and the duty to Christianize, but rule based on naked brutality risked undermining that claim and destabilizing the colonies. Royal policy began to grope toward regulation, to restrain the worst abuses, to insist that conversion and protection were part of imperial duty, and to keep colonists from acting like independent warlords. Yet enforcement across the Atlantic was weak. Distance favoured local power, and local power was built on labour. The Caribbean thus produced the first Spanish colonial systems: settlement anchored by ports and towns, labour organised through coercive grants, administration built through a mixture of royal instruction and local improvisation, and a religious mission that could sanctify conquest while also condemning its excesses. Above all, the islands created a new kind of momentum. Even as gold disappointed and populations collapsed, the Spanish presence did not retreat. Instead, it adapted, searching for richer lands and larger, more centralized sources of wealth. By the late 1510s, rumors and reports began to circulate with increasing insistence. Somewhere beyond the islands lay a mainland with great cities, organized states, and treasure on a scale the Caribbean had not offered. Veterans of Hispaniola and Cuba, hardened by conflict, experienced in building alliances and enforcing tribute, looked west and saw a solution to their crisis. If the islands could no longer provide enough labour or gold, then the empire would have to find new centres of power to conquer. The Caribbean, in other words, was not the end of Spain's westward gamble. It was the beginning of Spain's imperial method, an improvised system of conquest, turning into governance, of spiritual language bound tightly to material demands, and of colonies that survived only by reaching outward. From these island ports, Spain would soon strike the mainland, where conquest would meet empires far larger and more complex than anything the Caribbean had contained. From Cuba's ports, the mainland no longer felt like a distant rumour. Spanish captains had heard of a coast where merchants traded fine cotton and cacao, where rulers commanded tribute, and where cities rose from lakes and valleys, for men shaped by the Caribbean, where gold was scarce and labour was collapsing. Mexico promised what the islands could not: concentrated wealth, larger populations, and political systems that could be seized and redirected. Hernán Cortés set out in 1519 in that atmosphere of impatience and opportunity. His expedition was possible because the Caribbean had become a staging ground. Ships, horses, weapons, and veterans of earlier fighting could be gathered quickly, financed by investors who expected returns, and justified by a crown that wanted revenue and expansion without letting any one commander become too independent. Cortés himself operated in that tension. He needed royal legitimacy, but he also needed freedom of action, and he moved fast before rivals or cautious officials could pull him back. When the Spaniards reached the Gulf Coast, they stepped into a political landscape that had its own logic long before Europeans arrived. The Aztec Empire, more accurately, a tribute empire led by the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, did not rule every community directly. It demanded goods, labour, and captives through networks of allied and subordinate city-states. Some benefited from the system. Many resented it. And along the empire's edges there were groups who had fought the Mexica for generations, measuring survival in shifting coalitions and old grudges. Cortez's most decisive weapon was the ability to insert himself into those rivalries. Indigenous allies did not join because they were dazzled by Europeans, but because they were calculating. Some coastal peoples saw a chance to break tribute demands that drained their harvests and their autonomy. Others hoped to settle scores with imperial garrisons and tax collectors. Even communities that feared Spanish intentions could see the immediate danger of standing alone if their neighbours chose alliance. As Cortés moved inland, diplomacy and coercion travelled together. He offered friendship and protection, demanded supplies, and took hostages when he felt it necessary to guarantee cooperation. Interpreters, especially a Nahua-speaking woman known as Malintzin, became essential, not as a magical solution, but as the practical bridge that allowed negotiations, threats, and promises to be understood. Words mattered, because conquest in this setting began as politics, securing food, guides, and legitimacy through agreements that could always fracture. The Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies of the Mexica, became the most important of these partners after fierce fighting and hard bargaining. Their alliance transformed the expedition from a raiding party into a coalition army. Thousands of indigenous fighters brought local knowledge, manpower, and a strategic aim of their own, breaking the Mexica's dominance. From this point it becomes impossible to tell the story as a few Spaniards overpowering an empire. Spaniards supplied a mobile striking force and a claim to a new kind of authority, but the war's scale depended on indigenous decisions. The march toward the Valley of Mexico carried a momentum that was both military and psychological. Spanish steel swords, crossbows, and early firearms could be terrifying in close encounters, and horses added speed and shock value, especially against opponents encountering them for the first time. Yet these advantages were limited. Firearms were slow, unreliable, and few. Horses required care and could be killed. What mattered more was combined tactics, disciplined formations, the use of cavalry for sudden charges, and the ability to concentrate force at critical moments, often alongside large indigenous contingents who fought with their own weapons, their own leaders, and their own reasons. When Cortés entered Tenochtitlan, he reached a city that astonished outsiders, not because it was mysterious, but because it was unmistakably organized and powerful. Built on an island, linked by causeways, supplied by canoe traffic, and surrounded by chinampa fields that fed dense populations, it was the hub of an imperial system. Its markets, temples, and palaces were the visible face of tribute flowing in from many regions. The meeting between Cortés and the Mexica ruler Moctezuma unfolded as a precarious attempt to manage danger through ceremony and calculation. Moctezuma was not a passive figure bewitched by prophecy. He was a leader navigating uncertainty. He faced internal political pressures, external enemies, and a sudden armed coalition at his gates. Allowing the Spaniards into the city could be read as containment. Watching them closely, controlling their supplies, learning their intentions. For Cortés, entering peacefully was a strategic victory, because it placed him at the empire's centre without having to fight across the causeways. Then the balance snapped. Cortés seized Moctezuma and held him as a hostage, trying to turn imperial authority into a lever for Spanish demands. This was a familiar Caribbean tactic applied to a far larger state. It created short-term leverage, but it also undermined the legitimacy that held the tribute empire together. When violence broke out, sparked by Spanish actions during Cortés's absence, and escalated by panic and outrage, the city rose. The Spaniards and their allies were forced into a brutal retreat, suffering heavy losses as they fled across the causeways under attack. What followed was not a single dramatic victory, but a grinding campaign shaped by logistics, alliances, and disease. Smallpox arrived in the valley, in 1520, likely carried through the networks of war and contact. It spread through densely populated communities with devastating speed, killing leaders and commoners alike, disrupting food production, and weakening armies that still had to defend the city and the empire. Disease did not win the war by itself, but it reshaped the conditions of every decision, reducing the defenders' capacity at the moment the invaders were regrouping. Cortés returned with reinforced alliances, especially with Tlaxcala, and with a clear strategic aim: isolate Tenochtitlan. He built and assembled small vessels to contest the lake, cutting canoe traffic and limiting supplies. He targeted the causeways and the towns around the lake, not merely to punish, but to sever the city from its tributary lifelines. Siege warfare turned the valley into a landscape of starvation, displacement, and relentless fighting. Neighborhoods became battlegrounds. Water sources were threatened. Hunger and disease spread as the city's defences tightened inward. In 1521, Tenochtitlan fell after months of destruction. The human cost was immense: combat deaths, mass starvation, and epidemic mortality layered atop each other. The victors did not inherit a functioning capital so much as a shattered centre they would rebuild into Mexico City, laying Spanish streets and institutions over the ruins of a Mexico world. The immediate consequences were a redistribution of power rather than a clean replacement. Indigenous allies expected rewards, autonomy, reduced tribute, and status in a new order. Some received privileges, at least temporarily, and many local elites were incorporated into the colonial system as intermediaries. But Spanish demands for labour, tribute, and land expanded quickly. The conquest became the foundation of New Spain, a colony organised around extracting wealth, converting souls, and channeling indigenous communities into predictable obligations under Spanish oversight. Cortés's victory also became a template and a warning for what Spain would do next. It showed that empires could be toppled not just by foreign arms, but by exploiting existing fractures, by capturing political centres, by turning tribute networks into colonial taxation, and by letting disease do what weapons could not. It also revealed the instability of conquest itself. Alliances could shift, promises could be broken, and victory could leave behind a devastated society that still had to be governed. In Mexico, Spain had not simply found treasure. It had found an imperial heartland, dense, organised, and traumatically transformed, on which a global empire could be built. Out of the wreckage of Tenochtitlan, Spain faced a problem that conquest never solved on its own: how to make victory durable. Loot could be carried away. An empire could not. New Spain had to be turned into a place where orders could be issued, taxes collected, labour organised, disputes judged, and loyalties managed, year after year, far from the royal court. The first step was urban and administrative. The Spaniards rebuilt the ruined island city as Mexico City, laying out plazas, streets, and a new civic centre where power could be performed in familiar forms. Across the conquered regions they founded or refounded towns, because towns were the basic units of Spanish rule. Each town had a cabildo, a municipal council of local Spanish notables, which managed markets, public works, policing, and local regulations. Cabildos were practical tools, places to register property, assign labour drafts, settle quarrels, and coordinate defence. But they were also political statements. They made conquest look like governance, anchoring Spanish authority in stone and paperwork. Yet the crown did not intend New Spain to become a patchwork of private lordships. Royal authority moved in alongside the conquerors. Officials arrived to audit, to hear complaints, to enforce the king's claims over land and people. Courts and treasuries grew around the capital, and legal language, petitions, licenses, investigations became a weapon as sharp as any sword. The conquest leaders wanted rewards and autonomy. The monarchy wanted revenue and obedience. That tension would shape the colony for generations. In the short term, the crown relied on the very men it feared. The most important institution was the encomienda. In theory, an encomienda was not ownership of land or of people. It was a grant of the right to receive tribute and labour from specific indigenous communities. In return, the encomendero was supposed to protect those communities, maintain order, and support their Christian instruction. In practice, it spread quickly because it solved immediate problems. The conquerors demanded compensation. The colony needed a way to feed Spanish towns, supply expeditions, and keep soldiers from turning into uncontrolled raiders. The encomienda converted indigenous tribute systems into Spanish income, using existing community structures to deliver predictable obligations. Its human consequences were severe. Tribute could mean maize, textiles, cacao or Labour Days, demands that bit into household survival, especially after war and epidemic. Labour was often extracted through coercion, enforced by local violence, and backed by colonial courts that tended to favour Spaniards. Communities were pushed to meet quotas even as disease reduced their numbers, creating a brutal spiral: fewer people, the same demands, deeper exhaustion. The encomienda did not only take goods, it reshaped time itself, pulling men and women away from their fields and crafts, and making survival dependent on negotiations with new masters. The crown's dependence on the encomienda was real, but so was its fear of it. A class of encomenderos, enriched and armed, could become a rival nobility in the Americas, men who thought conquest gave them hereditary rights. Spain had just completed centuries of struggle to curb overmighty lords at home. It did not want to recreate them overseas. So even as it granted encomiendas, it tried to limit them, defining obligations, hearing indigenous complaints, and later pushing to prevent perpetual inheritance. The monarchy's goal was not humanitarian purity. It was control. If indigenous labour and tribute were the foundation of wealth, the crown wanted that foundation to support royal power, not private warlords. Alongside tribute and law came the church, the second pillar of colonization. Missionization in New Spain was sincere for many clergy and useful for the state. Conversion offered a language of legitimacy. Spain could present its rule as the spread of Christianity rather than naked conquest. Religious orders established missions, churches and schools, learning local languages to preach and to administer new communities. Baptism, marriage and burial drew everyday life into a Christian calendar, and new saints' days and processions began to structure public time. But conversion was also coercion and cultural transformation. Temples were dismantled or repurposed, sacred spaces redefined, and public worship policed. Indigenous religions did not vanish. They adapted, blending with Christian forms in ways that could preserve meanings under new names. Still, the pressure was constant. To abandon old rituals, to accept new moral rules, to reimagine the cosmos under a colonial church that was tied to Spanish authority. Priests recorded births and marriages, mediated disputes, and sometimes defended communities against the worst abuses. Yet they also helped make those communities legible and governable. A new society formed in the spaces between these institutions. Spaniards sat at the top of a hierarchy that valued purity of Spanish ancestry and proximity to power. Beneath them were growing populations of mixed ancestry, and at the bottom, the vast indigenous majority, still organized in towns with their own leaders, but increasingly constrained by tribute demands and colonial courts. Enslaved Africans also entered New Spain, especially in ports and cities, adding another layer to a society already sorting people by origin, status, and perceived rights. These categories were never perfectly fixed in daily life. Wealth, connections, and local circumstance mattered. but they shaped law, marriage, employment, and the assumptions of who could command and who must obey. Urban life made the new order tangible. In Mexico City, the plaza became the stage of authority. Markets selling maize, chiles, textiles, and Spanish imports, notaries drafting contracts, guilds of craftsmen shaping leather, metal, and cloth, officials collecting fees, friars preaching, indigenous porters carrying goods through streets laid atop older causeways. Outside the capital, agriculture and ranching expanded to feed towns and mines, and Spanish livestock changed landscapes, cattle, sheep, and horses, spreading across valleys where fields and waterways had once been tightly managed for dense indigenous farming. Workshops and regional trade networks linked villages to cities, moving food, tools, cloth, and building materials. Wealth increasingly came not from plundered treasure, but from steady production and extraction, systems that required order, records, and disciplined labor. By turning conquest into routine cabildos and courts, encomiendas and missions, towns and trade, Spain built New Spain into something more than a battlefield's aftermath. It was a colony designed to endure, profitable, Christian, and governed in the king's name. Yet it rested on contradictions that never fully settled: reliance on indigenous communities and their labor, fear of powerful conquerors, and the constant effort to translate a shattered world into a controlled one. While New Spain was being turned from a conquest into a colony, Spanish attention also swung south along the Pacific coast, toward the Andean world, an empire not built around a single lake city like Tenochtitlan, but stretched across mountains, deserts, and high plateaus, tied together by roads, storehouses, and an unusually centralized state. Before the Spaniards arrived, the Inca Empire ruled through a layered political structure. At the top stood the Sapa Inca, whose authority was both dynastic and sacred. Beneath him, administrators organized the population through kin-based units, keeping records with knotted cords called quipus, and moving goods through a vast network of state warehouses. Labor was the heart of the system. Communities owed work to the state, building terraces, maintaining roads, serving in armies, rather than paying taxes in coin. In return, the state provided security and redistributed food in times of need. The empire's strength was logistical. Steep terrain could be crossed, armies could be fed, and distant regions could be held together by planned movement and stored surplus. But that strength depended on a stable centre, and the moment the Spaniards entered the Andes, the centre was cracking. A succession crisis had become a civil war between two royal brothers. Years of conflict had exhausted armies, disrupted tribute and labour obligations, and sharpened resentments in newly conquered provinces that had never fully accepted Inca rule. Disease, carried ahead of Europeans along trade and travel routes, had already undermined the imperial household and its legitimacy. What the Spaniards encountered was not a united empire, ready to face an external threat, but a bruised political landscape filled with factions looking for advantage. Francisco Pizarro arrived with a small force by Andean standards, but he carried a method, already tested in the Caribbean and Mexico: strike at the top, seize the person who embodied authority, and force a political collapse that numbers alone could not achieve. In 1532, he met the victorious Inca claimant Atahualpa in the highland town of Cajamarca. Atahualpa had just defeated his rivals and was consolidating power. His confidence and the expectation that strangers could be managed through ceremony and display helped create an opening. The Spaniards captured him in a sudden assault, turning a diplomatic encounter into a decapitation of sovereignty. The consequences rippled outward. In the Inca political system, commands flowed from the ruler through a hierarchy of officials and kin ties. With Atahualpa held hostage, Spaniards could issue orders in his name, demanding gold and silver as ransom, and using the captive ruler to quiet immediate resistance. The ransom enriched the conquerors, but it also did something more destabilizing. It taught everyone watching that the old rules had been broken, that the sacred body of the ruler could be seized, and that wealth could be extracted by force without the reciprocity that had legitimized Inca demands. When Atahualpa was executed after the ransom was delivered, the shock was not only moral and political, it was administrative. The empire's central node had been removed, and rival claimants and regional leaders recalculated their loyalties. As in Mexico, Spanish victory depended on indigenous collaboration as much as Spanish weaponry. Many Andean groups had been incorporated into the Inca Empire only recently, and some saw the newcomers as useful allies against Cuzco's dominance. Others tried to play Spaniards and Incas against each other, bargaining for autonomy, settling old grievances, or seeking protection. Coalitions shifted repeatedly, because it was not always clear who would win, and because Spanish demands, food, porters, and labour, could be as burdensome as Inca ones. The conquerors, operating far from their bases, relied on local supplies and guides, and on indigenous intermediaries who could translate not only language but political expectations. The fall of Cuzco did not end the struggle. Conquest in the Andes was not a single collapse. It was an extended contest across difficult geography, with long supply lines and pockets of determined resistance. Inca elites attempted to preserve a restored state under new leadership, sometimes cooperating tactically and sometimes fighting outright. The Spaniards themselves fractured as rival factions fought over spoils, offices, and control of indigenous labour. These internal Spanish conflicts mattered because they weakened coordination and forced the crown to intervene more directly, just as it had in New Spain. Conquest leaders could win battles, but they were unreliable builders of stable royal authority. A new colonial centre emerged on the coast. In 1535, the city of Lima was founded to anchor Spanish power near the sea, closer to maritime supply routes and communication with Panama and Spain. The choice reflected hard lessons about logistics and control. The highlands were politically central to the Andes, but the coast connected the colony to the wider empire. From Lima, Spanish officials could manage shipping, oversee taxation, and project authority into the interior through governors, courts, and eventually a more formalized bureaucracy. By the early 1540s, the crown created the Viceroyalty of Peru, signaling that the Andes were not merely another frontier, but a pillar of imperial wealth and strategy. A viceroy, backed by royal courts and treasuries, was meant to discipline unruly conquistadors, regulate labour systems, and secure the king's share. Yet consolidation was slow and violent. Remote valleys and rugged mountain zones offered refuge to Inca resistance, and imperial roads that had once served Cuzco could now serve rebels as well. Campaigns dragged on for decades, punctuated by negotiations, betrayals, and shifting alliances, until the last major Inca strongholds were broken in the later 16th century. What ultimately made Peru central to Spain's empire was not only the dramatic capture of an emperor, but the transformation of Andean labour and administration into a mining-centred economy. The conquest redirected an existing system of state-organised work towards Spanish priorities, pushing communities into new drafts and tribute demands that would feed the mines and the cities that served them. The Andes had long been a world of organised labour and long-distance provisioning. Under Spanish rule, those same capacities would be bent toward extraction, toward silver above all, turning Peru into a core engine of imperial finance, and making the long, harsh process of consolidation worth the cost in the eyes of the crown. That mining-centred economy found its symbol and its brutal efficiency high on a wind-scoured plateau in the southern Andes. In the mid-16th century, a rich silver mountain was identified near an indigenous settlement called Potosi. The ore was not merely abundant, it was concentrated on a scale that made earlier Caribbean plunder and even the first Andean ransoms seem small by comparison. A city rose almost overnight in a place that, by ordinary standards, should not have supported one thin air, bitter cold, few trees, and long distances to food and fuel. Yet people came in waves: merchants, officials, priests, muleteers, craftsmen, and above all, coerced workers. Potosi became less a town than a machine, pulling labour and supplies from across the Andes and turning stone into coin. The technology and organisation that made Potosi truly world-changing developed quickly. Early on, miners followed rich veins and smelted ore in small furnaces. But as the easiest ore declined and production demanded greater throughput, the industry shifted toward mercury amalgamation, a process that allowed lower-grade ore to be refined in massive quantities. Mercury, poisonous, difficult to handle, and essential to the new method, was itself mined and controlled, most importantly from Huancavelica in Peru. The Crown's ability to regulate mercury supplies gave it leverage over silver output, and silver output increasingly meant imperial survival. Watermills were built to crush ore. Networks of dams and channels were cut into the highland landscape. Herds of mules and llamas moved constantly along mountain roads, carrying ore, mercury, tools, and food. Potosi's scale changed what the Spanish Empire could attempt, because it promised a regular, taxable stream of bullion rather than sporadic windfalls. To feed this engine, Spain adapted an older Andean institution, the meter. Under the Incas, communities had owed rotating labour to the state, framed as a collective obligation with reciprocal support. The Spanish recast it into a draft for mining and related work, administered through colonial officials and local indigenous leaders who were compelled to meet quotas. Men were pulled from villages for weeks or months at a time and sent to high-altitude mines or refining mills, often far from their families and fields. Some workers were paid wages, but coercion defined the system, the draft itself, the debt that accumulated through prices and fees, and the harsh discipline of the workplace. Alongside the meter were other forms of labour pressure, tribute in cash that forced participation in the market, and private demands for service in transport, milling and provisioning. The social consequences were profound. Communities lost labour at critical agricultural seasons, weakening their ability to maintain terraces, irrigation, and herds. Families reorganised around absence and risk. Many drafted workers died from accidents, exposure, and lung disease, while mercury poisoning and contamination spread through refining centres. Others fled, becoming migrants in Spanish towns or moving to remote regions to escape the draft, which in turn tightened pressure on those who remained. New layers of intermediaries grew powerful. Some indigenous officials who managed draft lists, Spanish mine owners, merchants who sold supplies at inflated prices, and administrators who counted and taxed the metal. In the Andes, conquest matured into a society structured around extraction, towns, roads, and markets oriented towards silver, and rural life increasingly shaped by the need to meet colonial demands in coin. From Potosi, the silver travelled outward in guarded streams. It moved to the Pacific port of Arica, and up to Lima, then north to Panama, and across the Caribbean to the great Atlantic staging points. The Crown claimed its royal fifth and other taxes, and the rest flowed through merchants, creditors, and officials. Silver became the lifeblood of Habsburg policy. Spain fought long wars to defend its European position, to support allies, to suppress revolts, and to maintain garrisons and fleets from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. The New World's bullion did not simply enrich Spain, it underwrote a global military posture. It allowed the monarchy to borrow heavily on the expectation of future shipments, tying imperial strategy to the rhythms of extraction and the hazards of the sea. Yet the same silver that financed empire also warped it. A flood of bullion increased the money supply across Europe, driving a long inflation that raised prices faster than wages and squeezed fixed incomes. Spain felt this acutely. Costs rose, while much of the silver quickly left the kingdom to pay foreign bankers, purchase grain, and buy manufactured goods from more productive economies. Easy access to bullion discouraged the patient work of building domestic industry and a broad tax base. Royal finances came to depend on extraordinary influxes rather than resilient revenue, and the monarchy repeatedly found itself rich in metal but short of liquidity, forced into cycles of borrowing and default as expenses outran even American treasure. The Atlantic itself became part of the economic system to protect the flow of bullion. Spain organized convoy fleets and fortified ports, creating a schedule of departures and arrivals that tried to balance commerce with security. But concentrated treasure attracted predators. Privateers and pirates hunted the routes. Rival states saw Spanish silver as the fuel of Habsburg power and therefore a legitimate target. The cost of protection rose. More warships, more garrisons, more bureaucratic oversight, more taxes on colonial trade. Smuggling expanded wherever regulation tightened, and corruption followed opportunity as officials and merchants found ways to skim value from a system built around a single glittering commodity. In the short term, Potosi made Spain's global ambitions possible. In the long term, dependence on silver created vulnerabilities that deepened with every decade. Production could falter with labor flight, disease, flooding, or mercury shortages. A storm or an enemy raid could disrupt remittances that European policy had already spent on credit. And as Spain committed itself to wars justified by dynastic claims and confessional struggle, it tied the fate of the monarchy to a volatile chain stretching from Andean mines to Atlantic convoys to European battlefields. The mountain of Potosi was not only a source of wealth, it was an imperial engine whose power came with a hidden design. It encouraged Spain to live on extraction, to finance greatness with a river of silver, and to accept risks that would one day become unbearable. When that river of silver began to take on a regular rhythm, it entered a monarchy whose ambitions were no longer merely Spanish. In 1516, the crown passed to Charles, a young ruler raised in the Burgundian Netherlands who inherited Spain not as an isolated kingdom, but as the keystone of a vast family compact. From his grandparents he drew different worlds at once: the Spanish crowns with their Atlantic openings, the Habsburg lands in Central Europe, and the Burgundian inheritance with its wealthy cities and strategic coastline. When he was later elected Holy Roman Emperor, those pieces formed a dynastic empire stitched together by titles, marriages, and law, more a web of obligations than a single state. But Spain, with its ocean routes and growing American revenues, became the hub that could move money and men across that web. This was also the beginning of the great contradiction of Habsburg Spain. The empire was global, but its rulers' problems were relentlessly European. Charles spent much of his reign fighting for dominance in Italy, where control of Milan, Naples, and the sea lanes of the western Mediterranean meant security for Spain and prestige for the dynasty. France, encircled by Habsburg possessions, resisted with equal determination, and the rivalry became a grinding cycle of campaigns, ransoms, and shifting coalitions. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire pressed from the east and south, threatening Habsburg Austria by land and challenging Spanish power at sea. North African corsair bases, tied into Ottoman strategy, raided coasts and shipping, turning the Mediterranean into another costly front. Spain's American conquests widened the monarchy's horizon, but they did not narrow its dangers. They multiplied them. In that setting, American wealth mattered less as a treasure chest than as a credit system. Silver offered a way to pay soldiers, subsidize allies, and keep fleets at sea, and just as importantly, it offered bankers a reason to lend. The monarchy could sign contracts and issue long-term promises backed by expected bullion shipments. Yet even Potosi could not make the empire solvent in a simple way. Wars were expensive because they were fought with professional armies, artillery trains, and fortified frontiers. Supply had to be purchased. Garrisons had to be maintained in Italy, along the Pyrenees in North Africa, and across the Habsburg lands. The crown's ordinary tax base in Castile, though substantial, was narrow and heavily burdened, while other parts of Spain guarded their fiscal privileges. Much of the silver passed quickly through Spain to pay foreign creditors and buy imports, because the empire needed grain, weapons, cloth, and naval materials that Spanish production could not reliably provide. The monarchy was often wealthy on paper and desperate in practice, its commitments expanding faster than any single revenue stream could follow. So Charles's reign was also an age of administrative construction, an attempt to govern distance with paperwork, and to turn conquest into a durable system. In Spain, decision-making gathered around specialized councils, bodies that handled particular regions and functions, advising the king and translating royal will into orders. For the Americas, institutions like the Council of the Indies and the Casa de la Contratación helped regulate trade, appointments, and law, turning the ocean into a supervised corridor rather than a frontier of private adventure. Across the Atlantic, the crown expanded the logic of viceroyalty. The viceroy served as the king's representative in a continent-sized jurisdiction, supported by audiencias that acted as high courts and administrative centres. Below them, governors, corregidores, and local councils reached into towns and indigenous communities, collecting tribute, supervising labour drafts, and enforcing royal monopolies. This was bureaucratic rule, not because it was gentle, but because it was meant to be legible. The Crown wanted registers, inspections, and lawsuits. It wanted competing authorities that could report on each other. It wanted a paper trail that turned violence and extraction into something the king could tax and, at least in theory, restrain. This impulse produced constant negotiation and conflict between conquerors expecting rewards and officials enforcing limits, between settlers demanding labour and missionaries denouncing abuse, between colonial elites and royal agents sent to curb them. But over time, the monarchy's centre of gravity shifted away from the first generation of conquistadors toward lawyers, accountants, and administrators who treated empire as a set of offices and revenue flows. Religion gave this system its moral language and much of its political energy. Charles ruled as a Catholic monarch in an era when faith and statecraft were inseparable, and unity of belief was treated as a foundation of order. In Spain, this meant the continuing force of the Inquisition and suspicion of religious difference as a form of disloyalty. In the wider empire, Catholicism became both justification and tool. Conversion framed conquest as providential. Missionaries helped organize new communities, and church institutions became partners in governance, education, and record-keeping. At the same time, Charles faced the Protestant Reformation in Northern Europe, which threatened not only theology but dynastic legitimacy and imperial cohesion. Fighting heresy required diplomacy, councils, and war, and it added another layer of expense to an already overextended monarchy. By the 1550s, Charles had learned that a single ruler could not personally hold together so many fronts, languages, and political traditions. Exhaustion, debt, and the sheer complexity of his inheritance pushed him toward partition. In 1556 he abdicated, leaving the imperial title and the Austrian lands to his brother Ferdinand, and the Spanish crowns with their Italian possessions, the Netherlands, and the American Empire, to his son Philip. The handover did not end the Habsburg struggle, it reorganized it. Under Philip II, Spain would become more firmly the headquarters of this Western Habsburg monarchy, and the machinery of councils, viceroys, and guarded sea lanes would tighten further. The global empire, born from dynastic accident and fueled by American silver, was about to be centralized, more Spanish in its habits, more rigid in its controls, and more committed than ever to sustaining greatness on an increasingly costly foundation. Philip II inherited more than territories. He inherited a problem of coordination, how to make decisions for Naples and Mexico, for Flanders and Peru, while enemies probed the borders and creditors watched the sea lanes. Where Charles V had ruled on the move, Philip chose stillness. He fixed the monarchy's centre in Castile, and in time Madrid, an inland town without a great port, became the empire's nerve centre precisely because it was secure, central, and close to the court's paperwork. From there, the king could receive dispatches, issue orders, and force distant realities into forms he could read: petitions, reports, account books, and legal cases. Philip's style was intensely personal and methodical. He worked through councils of state, war, finance, the Indies, yet he insisted on seeing decisions pass across his desk. The result was a monarchy that could be astonishingly informed and also painfully slow. Messages from the Americas took months. Instructions returned just as slowly. Local officials learned to act first and justify later, knowing that by the time Madrid answered, the moment had often passed. But the accumulation of paper was not wasted motion. It was how authority travelled. Royal power became something that could be copied, sealed, archived, and cited in court. In a world of distance, that was a kind of strength. At the same time, Spain's peak depended on practical imperial infrastructure, systems that made ocean and continent predictable enough to exploit. The treasure fleets became the backbone. Rather than scattered private sailings, bullion and high-value goods were concentrated into guarded convoys that ran on schedules, backed by naval escorts and intelligence networks watching for privateers. Ports, arsenals, and shipyards, especially along the Andalusian rivers and coasts, were pulled into the monarchy's strategic orbit. Fortifications rose where the empire was most exposed. Caribbean harbours that sheltered the fleets, choke points guarding approaches to Mexico and Peru, and citadels in Italy and North Africa meant to deny rivals a staging ground. The empire spent heavily not only on conquest, but on keeping what had already been taken. To pay for it, Philip squeezed revenue from every available channel. Castile remained the fiscal engine, carrying the heaviest taxes and shouldering the weight of imperial defence. Sales, taxes, customs, and extraordinary grants from the Cortes were pushed again and again, while the crown also borrowed against future silver. In the Indies, the quinto, the royal fifth, skimmed bullion at the source, and monopolies and fees wrapped trade in layers of official permission. Paperwork itself became a tool of extraction: licenses, inspections, fines, and lawsuits that translated commerce into crown income. The monarchy's grandeur was built not only on silver, but on accounting, on the ability to measure, claim, and compel. Yet Philip believed that obedience required more than money and guns. It required unity, and in the 16th century unity meant Catholicism. Spain's rulers treated religious difference as political risk, a crack where foreign influence, rebellion, or social disorder might enter. Under Philip, enforcement hardened. The Inquisition remained a feared instrument, policing converted minorities and suppressing Protestant ideas. Books were monitored. Universities and clergy were expected to defend orthodoxy. Suspicion became a public habit. This pursuit of religious uniformity gave the monarchy a powerful language of legitimacy, defender of the faith, champion against heresy, but it also carried costs. Talent and capital could be driven into silence or flight. Fear narrowed debate, and the insistence on uniformity made compromise with dissenting provinces far more difficult, especially where Protestantism was taking root. Spain's peak was therefore not peaceful. In the Mediterranean, the Ottoman rivalry continued to shape priorities. The empire of sultans pressed across North Africa and the eastern sea lanes, while corsairs raided coasts, seized captives and disrupted trade. For Spain, the Mediterranean was both frontline and lifeline. Italy had to be defended, and sea routes had to be kept open for troops and supplies. Philip's monarchy poured men and money into galleys, coastal towers and garrisons, fighting a war of attrition against raids and rival fleets. Even at the height of American riches, Spain could not choose its wars. Geography and rivalry chose them. Then in 1580, the map expanded again. A dynastic crisis in Portugal brought Philip the Portuguese crown, uniting the Iberian kingdoms under one monarch. This union did not erase Portuguese laws and institutions, but it placed Portugal's oceanic network under the same royal head. Suddenly Spain's reach extended through Portuguese forts and trading posts, along the coasts of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and into the routes of Asian commerce. Brazil, already a growing plantation colony, became part of the same imperial horizon as Mexico and Peru. The claim that the sun never set on the king's dominions was no longer rhetoric. It was geography, Atlantic and Pacific, Europe and the Americas, Africa and Asia linked, however imperfectly, by guarded routes and shared enemies. But the lived reality of this peak was unequal and often brutal. At court and in the great cities, nobles, office holders and merchants could profit from contracts, appointments, and the flow of colonial wealth. In the Indies, Spanish settlers and local elites benefited from land, labour systems and access to legal privileges, while the church acquired property and influence. Yet the burden fell heavily on others. Castilian taxpayers financing distant wars, sailors facing disease and shipwreck, soldiers garrisoned for years in unfamiliar climates, and most of all indigenous and African labourers whose coerced work sustained mines, plantations and workshops. A hierarchy of purity and status hardened over time, sorting people into ranked categories that shaped rights, opportunities and punishments. The empire's wealth was real, but it pooled at the top, and the machinery that gathered it, taxation, forced labour, monopolies and courts, made inequality feel permanent. By the late 1580s, Philip II presided over a monarchy that seemed vast beyond precedent, richer than its rivals on paper, more interconnected than any earlier European state, and defended by fleets, fortresses and files of orders signed in Madrid. And yet the very mechanisms that made global rule possible, centralization, religious rigidity, and constant military readiness, also made the system expensive, slow to adapt, and dependent on uninterrupted flows of silver and credit. Spain had reached a summit. The question was how long it could remain there when the winds of war and finance never stopped blowing. From that summit, Spain could see the next threat forming across the Channel. England was smaller, poorer, and far less imperial, yet it was positioned to wound the monarchy where it was most exposed, on the sea lanes that carried silver, soldiers and orders between Philip's scattered dominions. The drift toward war had several causes, layered rather than singular. Religion mattered because it shaped legitimacy. Protestant England under Elizabeth had become, in Spanish eyes, a sanctuary for heresy and a sponsor of rebellion. Strategic competition mattered because the Dutch revolt in the Spanish Netherlands could not be contained if it were supplied from the sea. And privateering mattered because it turned ideology into profit. English captains, half pirates, half state contractors, raided Spanish shipping and ports, selling captured cargoes at home and using the proceeds to finance further attacks. These voyages were not only theft, they were intelligence gathering and disruption, probing the edges of Spain's convoy system and forcing the crown to spend more on escort and fortification. By the mid-1580s, England's open support for the Dutch and Spain's determination to defend Catholic order and Habsburg security pushed both kingdoms into formal war. Philip's answer was the Armada, often remembered as a single fleet and a single moment, but better understood as an operation that demanded coordination across distance, precisely the kind of coordination his empire struggled to achieve. The plan depended on joining naval power with land power. A great fleet would sail from Iberia, clear the Channel, and escort an army from Flanders across to England. That army, experienced, disciplined, and already positioned near the coast, was meant to be the decisive weapon. The fleet's task was less to conquer than to protect a crossing, create temporary control of a narrow sea, and deliver soldiers into the heart of England's political centre. This was a strategy built on timing and logistics. It required ships, provisions, ammunition, and money gathered from many ports and many treasuries. It required favourable winds to keep a large formation together. It required constant communication between commanders, separated by coastline and enemy patrols. And it required suitable transport barges and flat-bottomed vessels ready in Flanders for an embarkation that could not be prepared openly without inviting attack. Spain could build a formidable fleet, but building a synchronized system with each part arriving at the right time was harder than assembling cannon and hulls. When the Armada sailed in 1588, these constraints quickly asserted themselves. The fleet was powerful, but it was not a single, simple instrument. Different squadrons had different sailing qualities. Many ships were adapted merchantmen rather than purpose-built warships. The command structure had to manage formation discipline, rationing and morale while dealing with weather that scattered ships and delayed progress. Spain's objective also narrowed its tactical options. The fleet needed to preserve itself to complete the escort mission, not gamble on an all-or-nothing battle that might leave it too damaged to protect the crossing. In the Channel, England exploited these pressures. English ships were generally more nimble and could engage at a distance with rapid gunnery, avoiding the close-quarters fighting where Spanish soldiers excelled. The fighting that followed was not a single decisive clash, but a series of engagements and manoeuvres, pursuit, harassment, and attempts to break formation. The Armada's greatest vulnerability remained the same. It could not complete its mission without meeting the army in Flanders, and that meeting point was itself difficult to reach and harder to hold. At a critical moment, disorder and confusion, amplified by fear of fire ships, and the challenge of maintaining formation, pushed the Spanish fleet away from the safe anchorage it needed. The result was not simply defeat by weather or defeat by tactics, but a chain of problems: imperfect coordination with Flanders, supply strain, the inability to force a protected embarkation, and the cumulative damage of repeated fighting. Then, as the Armada withdrew northward to return home by sailing around Scotland and Ireland, storms turned withdrawal into disaster. Ships already stressed by combat and crowding were driven onto unfamiliar coasts. Men drowned or died of exposure and hunger, or were killed after coming ashore. Nature did not replace strategy. It punished an operation whose margins for error were already thin. The immediate effects were both military and psychological. England celebrated survival as proof of providence and national resilience, and the war at sea gained political oxygen. Spain, for its part, did not collapse. It rebuilt fleets, continued to escort treasure, and remained the dominant land power in Europe. Yet the aura of inevitability, of Spain as unstoppable, was cracked. The war exposed that even a global empire with deep resources could be checked if its enemies targeted the connective tissue: shipping, ports, and coordination between theatres. Over the years that followed, maritime warfare pushed Spain to harden its defensive priorities. Convoys became even more central, escorts more costly, and coastal fortifications more urgent. Privateering and raids spread risk across the Atlantic world. threatening not only bullion but also credibility, because if the crown could not protect commerce, it could not easily borrow against it. The war's outcome, ending in 1604, did not hand mastery of the seas to England overnight, but it revealed limits that mattered. Spain could project power far from home, yet it could not fully control the sea lanes against persistent, well-placed rivals. An empire held together by water could survive storms and enemies, but it could not ignore how often the two arrived together. Even as the war with England flared and cooled, the deeper wound lay closer to Spain's northern frontier, in the wealthy, crowded provinces of the Netherlands. These were not distant colonies, but core European possessions, ports, workshops, and market towns that helped finance the Habsburg system. Holding them was not a matter of pride alone. It was a matter of keeping open the roads of money and soldiers that connected Spain to its wider strategy. The revolt that began in 1568 grew from tensions that had been building for years. The Netherlands had a long tradition of local privileges and negotiated rule. Town councils, provincial estates, and great merchants expected to be consulted, taxed carefully, and left room to manage their own affairs. But the Habsburg monarchy, faced with rising costs and constant war, pressed for more uniform control. New taxes and tighter administration felt, in the provinces, like a slow squeezing of autonomy, an attempt to turn a patchwork of self-governing communities into a more obedient machine. Religion turned that political friction into a crisis of legitimacy. Calvinism spread quickly through cities and trading networks, and for many communities it became bound up with resistance to outside authority. Philip II's government, shaped by the Catholic Reformation, treated religious dissent as rebellion in the making. When officials moved to enforce orthodoxy, punish heresy, and strengthen the hand of the Church, they struck not only at belief but at local power. The revolt did not begin as a simple nationalist uprising. It was a fight over who would command consciences, courts, and taxes, and whether the Netherlands would be governed through negotiation or through coercion. Spain answered with soldiers, and at first it seemed a response suited to a monarchy that still dominated European battlefields. Experienced troops marched north along the Spanish road, the overland artery that carried men and money from Italy through friendly territories toward Flanders. Yet every army that arrived brought another bill. Garrisons had to be paid, fortresses maintained, and sieges supplied. Campaigning in the Low Countries was particularly costly. Dense towns, canals, and strong walls meant war became a grinding contest of fortifications and field works rather than swift victories. And when money ran late, as it often did, discipline frayed. Mutinies and plundering by unpaid troops deepened hatred of Spanish rule and made reconciliation harder, feeding the cycle that prolonged the war. The financial strain was not an unfortunate side effect. It became one of the central drivers of Spain's difficulties. Silver from the Americas could be immense, but it arrived irregularly, and much of it was already promised to creditors before it ever reached Castile. The crown borrowed against future treasure to pay today's armies, then borrowed again to cover the interest. A rebellion in one corner of Europe thus echoed across the Atlantic. The need to fund Flanders shaped taxation at home, borrowing in Genoa, and the urgency with which fleets were loaded and dispatched from American ports. As the revolt continued, the Dutch provinces that held out began to transform their struggle into a new kind of power. Their strength did not rest primarily on vast land armies, but on ships, credit, and commerce. Dutch merchants and sailors entered the routes that Iberian crowns had tried to guard as monopolies, first as smugglers and privateers, then as builders of far-reaching trading systems. They learned to strike Spain where it hurt most, not always in grand battles, but in the costly disruption of shipping and the steady siphoning away of trade in the Atlantic, Dutch raiders and rival companies probed the edges of Spanish and Portuguese claims, looking for sugar, salt, slaves, and silver. In Asia, they challenged Iberian positions and inserted themselves into the spice trade. This was more than piracy. It was the rise of a maritime commercial rival whose success depended on weakening Spain's ability to police oceans. For Spain, the contest in the Netherlands was no longer only a European land war, it was a global competition over who would set the terms of trade and whose flags would be protected by force. That global pressure forced Spain into difficult choices. Every ship assigned to escorting treasure was a ship not available elsewhere. Every regiment shipped to Flanders was a regiment not stationed in the Caribbean or on the Pacific coast. Colonial defences, forts, militias, watchtowers, and local fleets were strengthened over time, but they were never enough to seal an empire that stretched across so much water. The convoy system reduced risk, yet it also concentrated it. Delays, storms, or enemy action could postpone a year's revenues, and a single capture could send shock waves through credit markets. European war thus shaped colonial life, not only by demanding silver, but by forcing American cities and ports to live under the constant expectation of attack. In the early 1600s, the conflict entered a wider inferno. The 30 Years' War began as a religious and constitutional struggle within the Holy Roman Empire, but it quickly became a contest among great powers. For the Spanish Habsburgs, it was both an opportunity and a trap. Spain fought to support its Austrian relatives, defend Catholic allies, and maintain strategic corridors linking Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries. Yet each new front widened the gap between commitments and resources. This was Habsburg overstretch in its most concrete form. Too many battlefields, too many garrisons, too many loans, and too few moments of decisive peace. By the 1640s, exhaustion had become a political fact. Revolts at home and defeats abroad signalled that Spain's capacity to enforce its will was no longer what it had been under Philip II's early confidence. When the Peace of Westphalia arrived in 1648, it closed the 30 Years' War and recognised the independence of the Dutch Republic. The significance was larger than the map. Westphalia signalled that the age of a single Catholic Habsburg order dominating Europe was fading. Spain remained a vast empire, still rich in territories and tradition, but the direction of power had shifted. A stubborn revolt in the Netherlands had become a proving ground for modern war, modern finance, and global competition, and Spain, forced to fight for decades without rest, emerged still standing, yet unmistakably diminished. With power in Europe slipping from Spain's grasp, the American kingdoms became even more essential, not only as sources of silver, but as spaces that had to be governed, defended, and kept loyal across immense distances. The paradox of Spanish rule in the Americas was that it claimed absolute authority in the name of the king, yet in practice it survived through paperwork, delegation, and constant negotiation. At the top stood the viceroyalties, New Spain and Peru first. Then later New Granada and Rio de la Plata, each meant to represent the monarch's presence in lands the monarch would never see. A viceroy could command armies, supervise officials, and preside over ceremony, but his power was intentionally hedged. Spain distrusted any single strongman growing too rooted in American soil. So alongside the viceroy stood audiencias, high courts that were also administrative councils, staffed by trained jurists whose job was to apply royal law and report abuses upward. Beneath them, a lattice of governors, corregidores, and municipal councils tried to make empire work town by town. City councils, cabildos handled markets, water supplies, street maintenance, and local militias. In emergencies, they could act with surprising independence, simply because decisions had to be made before news could cross the ocean and return. that distance shaped everything. Orders from Madrid were slow and often outdated on arrival. Local realities demanded improvisation. The Crown responded by building a system that valued records, inspections, account books, residency trials for departing officials, and an endless tide of reports. In theory, this was control. In practice, it was a way of managing uncertainty, correcting disasters after the fact, and keeping rival authorities balanced against one another. Colonial government was less a clean chain of command than a carefully maintained rivalry of offices, each watching the other. No institution was more deeply woven into daily life than the Church. Beyond preaching, it functioned as an administrator of people. Parishes kept registers of baptisms, marriages, and burials, turning households into legible entries of obligation and belonging. Religious orders spread through cities and frontiers alike. Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits and others, founding missions, schools and hospitals, and learning local languages to teach doctrine and discipline. Cathedrals and monasteries were not only spiritual centres but economic ones, supported by tithes, donations, rents and estates. The Church gave the empire moral authority and a vocabulary for hierarchy, but it also became a mediator, a place to complain, petition and seek protection, especially when secular officials were predatory. In the cities, Spanish America could feel intensely organized and public. Central plazas held markets crowded with maize, beans, chilies, cacao, textiles, candles and meat, goods brought in by indigenous traders and mule trains from surrounding countryside. Workshops rang with the work of tailors, shoemakers, carpenters and silversmiths, while scribes and notaries sat behind desks, turning life into contracts. Processions and feast days marked the calendar. Bells structured the hours. Yet the city's order depended on the countryside, where most people lived, and where the pressures of colonial rule were sharpest. Across broad valleys and high plateaus, haciendas expanded, large landed estates producing wheat, cattle, sugar, and wine for regional markets and for mining centres. Some labour was waged, some coerced, and much was trapped in debt and dependency, with workers tied to an estate store and a cycle of obligations. In older indigenous regions, communities were reorganized into towns, expected to pay tribute and supply labour drafts for mines and public works. Local leaders, often recognized as intermediaries, helped collect payments and maintain order, but their position was precarious, squeezed between community survival and imperial demands. Land loss introduced animals that trampled fields, and epidemics that hollowed families all intensified the strain, leaving villages to bargain desperately over what could be given and what must be preserved. Out of conquest and mixing grew a complex social hierarchy, often described in terms of race and caste, but lived as a shifting reality. Spaniards born in Iberia, the Peninsulares, held the highest prestige in many offices. American-born Spaniards, criollos, might be wealthy and educated yet blocked from top appointments. Below them, a broad and growing population of mestizos, free blacks, and people of mixed ancestry filled cities and rural towns as artisans, muleteers, soldiers, servants, and small traders. Enslaved Africans laboured in households, plantations, and ports, and their presence shaped culture and resistance from Mexico to Peru to the Caribbean. The law and custom tried to sort people into categories, but categories could be contested. Wealth, patronage, education, military service, and respectable marriage could soften boundaries. Appearance and reputation mattered, and documents, baptismal records, testimonies, and certificates could be used to argue a different identity. Because empire ran on law, it ran on petitions. Subjects wrote to officials and to the king, asking for exemptions, complaining of corruption, requesting land titles, disputing tribute, or seeking permission to found a town, a convent, a guild. Courts heard cases that dragged on for years, and the act of suing became a political tool. This bureaucracy could be suffocating, but it also offered a language of negotiation. Many communities survived not by defying Spain openly, but by learning how to use Spanish institutions, appealing to royal justice against local abuses, playing one authority against another, and insisting on written promises. Still, stability was never automatic. Rebellions flared when burdens spiked, new taxes, harsher labour drafts, attacks on local autonomy, or shortages that turned hunger into anger. Sometimes uprisings were dramatic, sometimes they were quiet. Flight from an estate, evasion of tribute, smuggling around monopolies, sabotage, and the steady refusal to comply in small ways that forced officials to compromise. Spain's American empire endured for centuries not because it ruled effortlessly, but because it adapted, mixing force with ritual, law with coercion, and lofty claims of royal authority with countless practical bargains made in plazas, parish offices and courtrooms far from the king's sight. Yet even as Spain struggled to hold its far-flung American kingdoms together with paperwork and compromise, the empire was becoming something even larger, an engine of exchange that reached beyond the Atlantic. Across the mountains of Mexico on the far side of the known world, a second ocean offered both opportunity and danger. To the crown, the Pacific was not simply empty water. It was a route to the richest markets on earth. Spain's push into the Pacific grew from the same pressures that had driven Columbus west: competition, spice, and the promise of Asian wealth. Portugal had already carved routes around Africa into the Indian Ocean, and Spain, bound by treaties and rivalries, searched for a way to claim access to Asia on its own terms. The Americas made that possible. New Spain provided ports, timber, sailors, and, most importantly, silver. With Mexico as a staging ground, Spain could attempt something audacious: a transoceanic bridge to East Asia. The Philippines became the keystone. When Spanish expeditions established a permanent foothold there in the later 16th century, it was not because the islands offered vast mines like Mexico or Peru. Their value was strategic. The archipelago sat close to the commercial heart of Asia, within reach of Chinese merchants, Southeast Asian traders, and the wider networks that flowed toward Japan and the Indies. Manila, founded as a Spanish city and port, was positioned to gather Asian goods into one place where Spain could tax, regulate, and protect them under its own flag. Out of that geography emerged one of the early modern world's most consequential systems: the Manila galleon trade. Each year, heavily built ships crossed the Pacific between Manila and Acapulco. The westbound journey from Mexico to the Philippines could be punishing, but the eastbound return was legendary: months of open ocean, storms, sickness, and the constant risk that a single catastrophe could erase an entire year's profits. These were not ordinary merchant vessels. They were floating warehouses and fortresses, designed to carry enormous cargoes and to fight if necessary. The logic of the system was simple, and it reshaped global trade. Spanish America produced silver on a scale unmatched elsewhere, especially from Mexico and the Andean mines. In East Asia, particularly in Ming and later Qing China, silver was in high demand as a monetary metal, useful for taxes, savings, and large transactions. In practice, this meant that American silver could buy what Europe wanted most: Asian luxury and craft goods. So bullion travelled west from Acapulco to Manila, then into the hands of Asian merchants, and onward through regional markets. In return came silk textiles, porcelain, lacquerware, spices, cottons, carved ivories, and countless small items of daily use and prestige. From Acapulco, these goods were hauled across Mexico to Veracruz and shipped onward to Spain or absorbed into American markets themselves. This trade altered consumption and status in ways that reached far beyond royal treasuries. Mexican elites could furnish homes with Chinese porcelain and wear silks that had crossed 2 oceans. In cities and mining towns, Asian textiles circulated through shops and fairs, sometimes blended with local styles and materials. The empire's wealth was no longer only measured in ingots and coins, but in the global flow of desirable things, objects that signaled connection to distant worlds. Strategically, the Pacific link shifted priorities. Manila had to be held, supplied, and defended, even though it was far from Spain and even far from Mexico. The Philippines became dependent on New Spain for subsidies, soldiers, and administrative support. In turn, New Spain gained influence as the hub that made the Pacific Empire function. The Spanish world was now tied together not only by Atlantic convoys, but by a second, thinner lifeline stretching across the largest ocean on Earth. In the Philippines, Spain built a colonial order that echoed patterns in the Americas, but with its own constraints. Missionary work was central. Religious orders organized parishes, founded schools, and tried to gather dispersed communities into more governable settlements. Conversion provided Spain with legitimacy and a framework for authority, while also creating local alliances and intermediaries who could translate imperial demands into village life. Spanish governance relied on a small European population supported by local elites, tribute systems, and military outposts. Control was strongest around Manila and key ports. Beyond them, authority thinned, negotiated continually with geography and local power. The Manila galleon system, for all its grandeur, was fragile. A long route meant slow communication and slow correction. Decisions made in Madrid could not respond quickly to events in Manila. Even Mexico City was distant. Raids and war magnified the danger. Rival European powers and privateers understood that a single captured galleon could be a fortune. Storms, shipworms, and navigational uncertainty could destroy ships without an enemy in sight. And because the trade was concentrated into a small number of massive voyages, disruption was not a minor inconvenience. It could become a crisis. In the end, Spain's Pacific connection reinforced both its power and its dependence. It demonstrated that the empire could operate on a planetary scale, turning American mines into global purchasing power. But it also bound Spain's fortunes to silver, to long-distance shipping, and to a world economy it could not fully control. The same routes that carried wealth carried vulnerability, and the same global reach that made Spain seem unstoppable also made the cost of holding the empire higher with every passing decade. Silver could purchase the world's goods, but it could not by itself create a strong economy at home. By the early 17th century, Spain was living inside a paradox of empire. American bullion continued to arrive, yet prosperity in Castile and much of the peninsula remained thin, uneven, and increasingly fragile. One reason was inflation. The great streams of silver from Mexico and the Andes expanded the money supply across Europe, pushing prices steadily upward over generations. Wages and fixed incomes rarely kept pace. In Spain, where much of the crown's ordinary revenue came from taxes approved in Castile, the rising cost of food, clothing, and transport meant that the same nominal income bought less each year. The empire seemed rich, but daily life felt more expensive, and the state's finances grew more strained. Just as important was what Spain did with its silver. Much of it passed through the kingdom rather than rooting itself in productive investment. War consumed enormous sums, and so did imports. Spain bought grain in bad years, textiles, arms, ship supplies, and luxury goods from more industrialized regions, Italy, the Low Countries, France, and beyond. The bullion that should have strengthened domestic production often became a payment method to foreign merchants and bankers. Spain's productive base remained weak. Agriculture was vulnerable to drought and disruption, and urban industry struggled against competition and policy choices that favoured privilege and status over manufacturing. As the century progressed, this imbalance hardened into deindustrialization. Castilian wool continued to flow outward, but much of the value-added work increasingly happened elsewhere. Cloth that might once have been made in Iberian towns was imported instead, sometimes even purchased with American silver, minted into coins in Seville or Mexico City. The empire's own trading rules encouraged concentration and rigidity, monopolies, regulated ports and licensing systems that were designed to control wealth, not necessarily to multiply it. Profits could be made through access and connections rather than innovation. Over time, that encouraged rent-seeking behaviour, competing to win privileges, offices and contracts instead of building workshops and expanding output. The Crown's response to constant military commitments was borrowing on a breathtaking scale. Habsburg Spain maintained armies in the Netherlands, garrisons in Italy, fleets to guard the Atlantic routes, and defences stretching from the Caribbean to the Philippines. Each theatre demanded money up front, and silver arrived on schedules that were uncertain, delayed by storms, raids, or administrative disruption. To bridge the gap, monarchs relied on short-term loans and long-term debt, drawing heavily on financiers who expected repayment from future tax streams and future bullion. This system could function, but it was brittle. When expenditures spiked or silver shipments failed to meet expectations, the monarchy declared suspension of payments, royal bankruptcies that shook credit and forced renegotiations. These defaults did not end the empire, but they raised the price of future borrowing and narrowed the crown's options. More revenue had to be committed to servicing debt, leaving less for reform or recovery. The state increasingly resembled a machine that existed to keep armies in the field and interest payments flowing, always vulnerable to a missed shipment or a lost campaign. Inside Spain, social and demographic pressures tightened the vice. Castile bore the heaviest tax burden, and the effort to extract more revenue met limits in population, productivity, and political consent. Some regions retained stronger legal protections against taxation or resisted new levies, which pushed the crown back toward the same overused sources. At the same time, expulsions, emigration to the Americas, war losses, and periodic disease outbreaks reduced labour in key areas. Rural communities struggled with debt, harvest failures, and the movement of land into large estates. A society that rewarded noble status and ecclesiastical careers could siphon talent away from commerce and crafts. The result was not sudden collapse, but slow erosion. Fewer taxpayers supporting greater obligations. These weaknesses showed themselves in war. Spain remained formidable, but the strategic initiative gradually slipped away. The long struggle in the Netherlands drained men and money for decades, and as Dutch power expanded at sea, the costs of protecting trade and communications climbed. Against France, Spain fought hard, but faced a rival with deeper demographic reserves and growing fiscal capacity. By mid-century, Spanish armies could still win battles, yet sustaining campaigns became harder. Defeats and unfavourable treaties did not instantly dismantle the empire, but they narrowed Spain's room to manoeuvre and signalled that Habsburg dominance was no longer inevitable. Corruption and administrative inertia compounded the damage. Empire ran on paperwork and patronage, and offices could become sources of private profit. Taxes were farmed out, contracts were awarded through connections, local officials sometimes delayed payments or diverted funds. Even when Madrid understood the problems, reform threatened entrenched interests, municipal elites, noble households, religious institutions, and the bureaucracies that managed imperial life. Decision-making slowed, and the system defaulted to familiar solutions: more borrowing, more privileges sold, more pressure on the same taxpayers. And yet the Spanish Empire endured. It endured because it had institutions that still worked well enough: councils, viceroyalties, audiencias, and a church network that reached into villages and towns. It endured because coercion remained real. Forts, fleets, and militias could still impose order where challenges arose. It endured because inertia itself is a kind of strength. Trade routes, legal structures, and social hierarchies do not vanish simply because balance sheets deteriorate. The empire could become poorer in relative power, less efficient, and more indebted, while continuing to function, still extracting silver, still administering cities, still defending its coasts 1 year and one convoy at a time. That endurance was tested at the very centre of the system when the Habsburg line in Spain reached its end. In 1700, King Charles II died without an heir. His death did not simply open a domestic succession question. It opened the possibility that the immense Spanish inheritance, Spain itself, its Italian possessions, the Spanish Netherlands, and the overseas empire, might be folded into another great power's orbit. Europe had spent generations trying to prevent any single dynasty from becoming too dominant. Now the fear was clear: if France and Spain were united under one Bourbon house, the balance of power could tilt decisively. 2 candidates represented 2 different futures. The French Bourbons supported Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV. The Austrian Habsburgs promoted an archduke, hoping to keep Spain tied to the old Habsburg web. Behind these legal claims stood strategic calculations: England and the Dutch Republic, maritime powers dependent on trade, worried about French control of Spanish ports and colonial markets. Austria wanted to block French expansion and preserve its influence in Italy. For Spain, the stakes were existential. Foreign armies would soon fight on Iberian soil to decide who wore the crown. The War of the Spanish Succession turned Spain into one theatre of a much larger conflict. Inside the peninsula, support split along regional and political lines. In broad terms, Castile leaned toward the Bourbon claimant, while parts of the Crown of Aragon, especially Catalonia and Valencia, resisted, fearing that a French-backed king would crush their traditional privileges. The war was therefore both an international contest and a civil struggle over the nature of the monarchy. When the fighting finally exhausted the contenders, the settlement did not preserve Spain's old European position. It preserved Spain's independence, but at a price. Philip V remained king, establishing the Bourbon dynasty that would rule Spain for the next century and beyond. Yet Spain's European outer ring was cut away. The Spanish Netherlands and major Italian possessions were transferred to Austria, while other key points went to rival powers. Gibraltar and Minorca passed to Britain, giving it permanent footholds that mattered not only as symbols but as bases shaping Mediterranean strategy for generations. Spain kept the Americas and the Philippines. Its oceanic empire remained intact. But in Europe, the map was redrawn to Spain's disadvantage. The deeper shift was not only territorial, it was institutional and ideological. Under the Habsburgs, Spain had often acted as a dynastic composite, a monarchy stitched together from regions with different laws and privileges, held in place by tradition, negotiation, and the demands of continental war. The early Bourbons brought a different model, influenced by French statecraft, centralization, uniformity, and administration designed to function like a single machine. The most dramatic early expression came after the war, when the crown moved to punish resistance and prevent future fragmentation. The old legal autonomy of Aragonese territories was curtailed, and Castilian-style institutions spread. This was not merely revenge, it was a program. A more centralized Spain, Bourbon ministers believed, could tax more reliably, raise troops more efficiently, and respond faster to threats. Rebuilding state capacity became the great project of the first half of the 18th century. Revenue had to be made steadier and less dependent on emergency borrowing. Administration had to become more professional, less captured by local privilege and old patronage networks. The military had to be updated with better organization, supply systems, and naval investment, because the empire's lifelines were maritime, and because Britain's growing sea power made the Atlantic and Caribbean increasingly contested spaces. This was also the moment when Spain's relationship to its colonies began to change in tone. The overseas empire had long been a source of bullion and status, but it was also bound up in a legal and religious vision. Kingdoms and subjects under a Catholic crown ruled through councils, viceroys, and negotiated local arrangements. The Bourbons increasingly approached the empire as a fiscal and strategic system that had to pay for its own defence and contribute more to the recovery of the metropole. If Spain had lost its richest European territories, then the Americas mattered even more, not only as prestige, but as the main reservoir of revenue. That logic pushed reform outward. To extract more, the Crown tightened supervision of trade, sought to reduce smuggling, and looked for ways to increase tax yields on commodities, customs, and monopolies. It also favoured officials who answered directly to the Crown rather than to local networks. Each change aimed to make imperial income more predictable and to ensure that wealth did not leak away into private hands, contraband routes, or semi-autonomous elites. But efficiency has a human cost. In the Americas, these efforts threatened established interests. Merchant groups accustomed to old arrangements, municipal councils that guarded their influence, and Creole elites who had built identity and power inside the Habsburg framework. Greater extraction meant higher burdens and closer scrutiny. Centralization meant fewer opportunities to negotiate exceptions. The empire was not yet in open revolt, but resentment had new fuel, the sense that Madrid now saw the colonies less as partner kingdoms and more as managed assets. By 1748, as Europe reached another uneasy peace, Spain had not returned to Habsburg-era dominance. Instead, it had chosen a different path. The dynasty had changed, the European perimeter had shrunk, and the purpose of empire was being rewritten. The age of dynastic, continent-spanning Habsburg war was giving way to a Bourbon vision of managerial control, an empire to be audited, defended, and made productive, stronger in some ways, more disciplined, and quietly more brittle in others. In the mid-18th century, the Bourbon vision of a more disciplined empire moved from plans on paper to a broad remaking of Spanish America. The purpose was practical: increase revenue, reduce corruption and contraband, and build defences strong enough to survive a world where Britain's naval power kept growing. But every attempt to make the empire more efficient also made it feel more intrusive, and in many places that intrusion became the seed of lasting political resentment. One of the clearest changes was administrative restructuring. The Crown sought to shorten the distance between Madrid and the provinces by multiplying points of supervision. New jurisdictions were carved out to weaken older centres of power and to respond to strategic needs. In the north, the Viceroyalty of New Granada was revived and strengthened, giving the Crown a closer hand over the Caribbean-facing regions and the Andean interior. In the south, the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata was created, shifting authority away from Lima and toward the Atlantic, where trade and defence against rivals demanded attention. Beneath the viceroys, a new layer of intendants, royal officials with broad fiscal and administrative authority, was introduced to bypass local municipal councils and entrenched patronage networks. The goal was to make the empire legible: more reports, more audits, clearer chains of command, and fewer compromises with local power. Economics followed the same logic. Spain's leaders believed the imperial system had grown too rigid, too dependent on a few ports, and too vulnerable to smuggling. Rather than simply squeezing the old structure harder, they tried to modernize it in a controlled way. Trade was partially liberalized within the empire, allowing more Spanish ports to send ships to the Americas and more American ports to trade legally within new regulations. In theory, this would expand commerce, undercut contraband, and raise customs revenue. In practice, it often meant sharper competition and new winners and losers. Monopoly arrangements and tax farms were reorganized, customs procedures tightened, and revenue drives expanded sales taxes and state monopolies on key goods. The Crown wanted a colonial economy that could fund a stronger navy, a larger army, and a recovering Spanish state, an empire that did not merely glitter with silver but paid its bills reliably. Defence, too, became a central obsession. The 7 Years' War exposed Spain's vulnerability when British forces seized Havana and Manila, briefly demonstrating how quickly the empire's arteries could be cut. Afterward, fortifications were improved, militias expanded, and coastal garrisons strengthened from the Caribbean to the Rio de la Plata. The Crown encouraged local military organization, including Creole participation, because the distances were too vast for Spain to defend the Americas with peninsular troops alone. Yet this created an unintended consequence. Creole elites gained military experience, command roles, and the habit of local coordination skills that would later matter when loyalty fractured. The human effect of all this was friction, especially in the social hierarchy that had long defined colonial life. The Bourbons increasingly favoured peninsulares, officials and merchants born in Spain for top posts in government, finance, and the higher church, believing they were more dependable agents of royal authority. Creoles, even wealthy and culturally Spanish, felt blocked from advancement in the lands where their families had lived for generations. They watched new administrators arrive with reforming zeal, empowered to inspect accounts and override local custom. The old arrangement in which local elites could negotiate and influence rule through cabildos and relationships seemed to narrow into something colder, an empire of professionalized control. That tension erupted repeatedly in open unrest, revealing how legitimacy could erode when reforms were experienced as extraction. In the Andes, resistance flared in massive rebellions that fused anger over taxes and labor demands with memories of conquest and the continuing burdens placed on indigenous communities. The Great Uprising, associated with Tupac Amaru II, showed that the social order could still be shaken at its base, and that Bourbon fiscal pressure could ignite long-suppressed grievances about tribute, forced labor, and abusive local officials. In New Granada, the Comunero revolt similarly rose from opposition to new taxes and monopolies, gathering broad support before being broken by negotiation and force. These movements were not simple independence wars, but they exposed something crucial. People obeyed the crown partly because they believed in a certain moral economy, limits, protections, and reciprocal obligations. When reforms seemed to discard those limits, obedience became conditional. By the late 18th century, the paradox of the Bourbon project was clear. The empire was in many ways stronger. Revenues rose, trade volumes increased, and defences improved. Administration became more standardized, and Madrid's ability to act in the Americas grew sharper. But the emotional bond between Crown and many of its American subjects grew weaker. Creole identity hardened into something more self-conscious. Spanish in language, religion, and law, yet increasingly distinct in interests and dignity. Excluded from top offices, burdened by new fiscal demands, and now practiced in local organization through militias, councils, and networks of educated clergy and lawyers, Creoles began to imagine political authority not only as something received from a distant king, but as something that could, in a crisis, be claimed and exercised at home. The reforms bought Spain time and resources, but at the cost of loyalty. By 1808, the imperial structure looked more orderly than it had a century earlier. Yet beneath that order lay a growing conviction among many in Spanish America that the empire's new efficiency was not a shared renewal, but a tightening grip, and that if the centre ever faltered, the provinces had both the reasons and the means to act on their own. In 1808, the centre did falter, and it did so in a way that struck at the very idea of legitimate rule. Spain had been pulled into the storms of the Napoleonic era, first as an uneasy ally of France against Britain, then as a state whose weakness invited exploitation. The Spanish court was riven by faction and mistrust, the treasury strained, the fleet battered, and confidence in royal direction already shaken. Napoleon saw a strategic opening. Control of Spain meant pressure on Britain, access to Spanish ports and resources, and a pathway to enforce the continental system against British trade. But it also meant, in practice, taking hold of a monarchy that was losing its authority even before foreign troops marched in. The crisis began as French forces entered Iberia under the pretext of moving against Portugal. Once inside, they did not simply pass through. They occupied key cities, and the Spanish royal family, caught between fear of France and anger at its own unpopularity, unravelled into abdications and confusion. Napoleon summoned the Bourbon monarchs into his grasp and replaced them with his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. The move was meant to be clean, legalistic, and final, an empire of decrees and dynastic rearrangements. Instead, it detonated a legitimacy crisis. Many Spaniards could endure bad ministers or harsh taxes, but a king imposed by a foreign conqueror challenged the foundations of sovereignty itself. Resistance erupted into what became the Peninsular War, a conflict of regular armies and relentless local warfare. Spanish forces fought set-piece battles when they could, but the war was also defined by sieges, reprisals, and the grinding uncertainty of occupation. Local communities organised bands to harass French lines of communication, while British troops, committed to keeping Napoleon tied down on the peninsula, joined the struggle. The war turned Spain into a battlefield for years, consuming revenue, disrupting administration, and shredding the state's capacity to govern at distance. As the old structures failed, Spaniards improvised new ones. Across the country, local and provincial juntas, emergency councils, claimed authority in the absence of a legitimate monarch. They raised troops, collected funds, issued orders, and coordinated resistance. This was not merely practical self-defense. It was a political earthquake. The question could no longer be avoided. If the king was captive or displaced, where did sovereignty reside? In traditional theory, authority flowed from the monarch. In the new reality, authority was exercised by bodies claiming to act in the name of the nation and the true king, even while the very act of claiming it hinted that political power could exist without direct royal command. From this improvised landscape emerged the Cortes of Cadiz, convened in a city that resisted French occupation and became a refuge for officials, soldiers, merchants, and political thinkers. There, representatives tried to rebuild the state while the war still raged. The Cadiz Cortes asserted that sovereignty lay in the nation, not solely in the person of a monarch, and it undertook a constitutional experiment meant to modernize Spain and bind the empire together on new terms. The Constitution of 1812 promised a unified political community, representation, and limits on royal power, and it spoke in the language of citizenship rather than colonial hierarchy. Yet the Cadiz project carried its own contradictions. It imagined a single Spanish nation spanning oceans, but the empire was not a blank slate. Spanish America had its own elites, corporate privileges, racialized social orders, and deep resentments sharpened by the Bourbon reforms. Cadiz offered representation, but representation was unequal and difficult to enact across war and distance. It proposed reforms that threatened entrenched interests, including the church's traditional privileges and the older structures of local power. Some embraced the constitution as a path to a reformed empire. Others saw it as peninsular politics exported overseas, too late and too uncertain to restore trust. Across the Atlantic, the shockwaves were immediate. News of abdications, occupation, and juntas arrived in fragments carried by ships and rumour, and every delay widened the space for local interpretation. American cities and provinces began forming their own juntas, often insisting that they remained loyal to the rightful king, while refusing to accept officials tied to French authority or to a discredited court. In practice, this meant self-government. Cabildos and militias, strengthened and politicized under the Bourbons, became instruments for asserting local sovereignty. The old language of loyalty remained, but the machinery of independence started turning under it. Spain's ability to reassert control was crippled by the war's demands. The peninsula needed men, money, and supplies merely to survive. Trade was disrupted by blockades and conflict at sea. Remittances and silver flows became less predictable, and imperial administration lost coherence as officials were captured, replaced, or ignored. Even where loyalist sentiment remained strong, Madrid could not reliably send troops, pay garrisons, or enforce policy. Power in the Americas increasingly belonged to whoever could organize locally, who could secure arms, collect revenue, and negotiate alliances among competing social groups. By the time Napoleon's grip weakened and the war drew toward its end, something irreversible had happened. The crisis had taught Spanish Americans that the empire's chain of command could snap, and that in the vacuum authority did not vanish, it relocated. Independence no longer needed to begin as a pure ideology. It could begin as an emergency measure justified as defense of order, faith, and the king's rights, and only later become an open break. Between 1808 and 1814, imperial legitimacy was not merely questioned. It was practiced away as provinces learned day by day that self-rule was not only imaginable but workable. By the early 1810s, those emergency measures hardened into rival claims of sovereignty. In Spanish America, many leaders still spoke the language of fidelity to Ferdinand VII, but loyalty was no longer a single shared position. Some argued that in the king's absence, authority reverted to local communities and their councils. Others insisted that only the established imperial hierarchy could preserve order. The legitimacy crisis, born in Napoleon's invasion, became a contest over who had the right to govern, tax, command militias, and speak for the people. The deeper fuel lay in the recent past. Bourbon reforms had tightened imperial control, raised revenues, professionalized bureaucracy, and expanded militia service. They also reduced Creole access to high office, empowered peninsular officials, and made the empire feel more extractive. When the centre cracked, old grievances turned into immediate power struggles between cities and provinces, merchants and landholders, royal officials and local councils. Independence was not one movement. It was many movements, shaped by local rivalries as much as by political ideals. The wars that followed were regional and uneven, fought across mountains, plains, tropical coasts, and long supply lines. They were civil wars as much as wars against Spain. In many areas, the key question was not abstract independence, but which side could offer protection, stable trade, and a tolerable social order. Loyalist armies often drew strength from groups who feared Creole dominance or upheaval, communities wary of new taxes, forced recruitment or the loss of traditional rights. Patriot forces, in turn, depended on coalitions that could shift quickly. Creole elites seeking autonomy, urban radicals demanding representation, free people of colour and enslaved people bargaining for freedom, and frontier fighters drawn by local loyalties more than ideology. In northern South America, Simón Bolívar emerged from this chaos as the most persistent strategist of independence. He was a Creole aristocrat with a sweeping vision, a liberated Spanish America that could avoid becoming a scatter of vulnerable republics. For Bolívar, independence required more than removing Spanish officials. It required building states strong enough to survive, with disciplined armies, reliable revenue, and political authority that could outlast the emergency of war. But his rise came through failure as well as triumph. Early republican experiments in Venezuela collapsed under military pressure and internal division. Patriot governments struggled to supply troops, and their promises often failed to reach the countryside. Royalist commanders exploited these fractures, recruiting local fighters by presenting themselves as defenders of religion, monarchy, and familiar hierarchies. The conflict became brutal, marked by reprisals that made neutrality difficult and reconciliation rarer. Bolívar adapted. He learned that victory depended on mobility, control of key river routes and highlands, and above all coalition building across social lines. The independence armies he helped assemble were not simply Creole militias. They incorporated Llanero horsemen from the plains, veterans hardened by years of campaigning, and fighters for whom emancipation or status was tied to service. Bolívar increasingly linked military recruitment to promises of freedom, though these promises were contested and unevenly fulfilled. His campaigns relied on daring movement, crossing difficult terrain to strike where Spanish forces were thin, seizing strategic cities, then using those gains to build legitimacy and gather resources. Out of these campaigns came new political experiments. Bolívar championed the creation of Gran Colombia, an ambitious union meant to bind Venezuela, New Granada, and Quito into a single state capable of resisting foreign pressure and internal fragmentation. It was a bold answer to the empire's collapse, where Spain had once provided a distant framework of unity. Bolívar tried to replace it with a republican one. Yet the same forces that had shattered imperial rule now strained the new republics. Regions that had fought for autonomy did not easily submit to centralized authority. Local commanders, provincial elites, and rival cities guarded their power. Bolívar's own political thinking, suspicious of unchecked faction, and fearful that weak institutions would invite anarchy, pushed him towards strong executive rule. To opponents, this looked like a betrayal of republican liberty. To Bolívar, it was a grim necessity in a landscape still shaped by war. Spain's defeat, in the end, was not simply a matter of lost battles. Geography worked against it. Distances were vast, communications slow, and campaigns expensive. The Peninsular War had drained Spain's manpower and finances, and the post-war state struggled to rebuild a navy capable of sustaining control across the Atlantic. Shipping troops and supplies grew harder as Spain's credit weakened and as international trade networks shifted. Britain, now the dominant maritime power, favoured open commerce with independent American states and had little interest in helping Spain restore a closed imperial system. The wider Atlantic world revolutionary precedent, new republics, and changing markets tilted against reconquest. By the mid-1820s, Spanish authority on the mainland had largely collapsed, leaving a map of new countries born from wartime alliances rather than settled consensus. Independence brought formal sovereignty, but it did not erase the colonial social order overnight. Old hierarchies of race, land, and labour persisted, even as legal categories shifted. Many states faced chronic instability, regional revolts, military strongmen, fragile finances, and unresolved questions about citizenship and rights. For Spain, the consequences were profound. The empire that had once been financed by American silver and organized around Atlantic monopoly now stood diminished, its global status reduced, and its politics shaken by loss. What remained were a few crucial colonies, especially Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and the Philippines across the Pacific. Territories that would become both symbols of lingering imperial ambition and pressure points in a world where Spain was no longer the central power shaping the oceans. What remained after the mainland breakaway was not a coherent imperial world, but a last ring of holdings that Spain treated as both lifeline and proof of continued stature. Cuba and Puerto Rico sat close to Atlantic routes and growing American markets. The Philippines, tied to Spain by long sea lanes and fragile budgets, anchored a residual presence in Asia. Spain held on partly because these territories were easier to supply and garrison than the vast interiors of the Americas, and partly because local elites, planters, merchants, and officials often feared the upheaval they associated with independence wars. For a weakened Spanish state, these colonies also mattered because they could still generate revenue through tariffs, monopolies, and export duties, even as the old silver engine was gone. In the 19th century, Cuba became the keystone. Its soil and climate made it ideal for sugar, and global demand surged. Sugar, however, was not simply a crop. It was an industrial system of mills, credit, shipping, and coercion. Planters invested heavily, borrowed heavily, and demanded predictable order. That order in Cuba leaned on slavery far longer than on the mainland. While much of Spanish America moved unevenly toward abolition during and after independence, Cuban sugar expanded through the importation of enslaved Africans and the tightening of plantation discipline. Spain, dependent on Cuban wealth, tolerated and protected the system even as international pressure against the slave trade mounted and as abolitionist ideals spread, that made Cuba central and combustible. The island's prosperity created a powerful planter class, but it also sharpened social fears of slave revolt, of racial war, and of a repetition of Haiti's revolution. These fears often pushed elites toward the Spanish state, which presented itself as the guarantor of stability. At the same time, Spanish rule became more extractive. Trade rules and taxes channeled wealth toward metropolitan needs and toward peninsular merchants favored by the colonial administration. Reformers called for representation, freer trade, and autonomy, demands that were repeatedly postponed or limited, especially when Madrid worried that concessions might be the first step toward separation. Puerto Rico followed a different rhythm, smaller, less dominated by vast sugar fortunes, and with a colonial society where reformist currents could be absorbed more readily. Spain experimented with limited changes there earlier than in Cuba, including gradual political reforms late in the century. But Puerto Rico, too, lived under an imperial structure that treated the colony as a revenue source and strategic outpost, not a partner with equal voice. Across the Pacific, Spain's position in the Philippines was more precarious than it looked on maps. The colony's economy was being reshaped by global trade and by export crops, while older monopolies and privileges eroded. A small Spanish population relied on local intermediaries, religious orders with large landholdings, and a bureaucracy that struggled to project authority across an archipelago. Education and travel created a new class of Filipino professionals who could compare Spanish rule with other possibilities. They did not begin as separatists. Many asked first for equality before the law, representation, and an end to abuses associated with arbitrary local power and clerical dominance. When reform seemed blocked, nationalism hardened. In Cuba, the same pattern: reform delayed, power concentrated, society strained by labor systems produced open rebellion. In 1868, a major uprising began and dragged on for years. It revealed how difficult it was for Spain to fight a long counterinsurgency across an island with dense rural networks and valuable coastal towns. Spain could send soldiers, but sustaining them was expensive. The war strained Spanish politics and finances, and it did not resolve the underlying issue of autonomy and identity. A later revolt in the 1890s reignited the crisis with broader organisation and clearer separatist aims. Spain responded with harsh measures meant to separate insurgents from civilian support, concentrating rural populations and intensifying hunger and disease. Repression, rather than pacifying the island, increased bitterness and drew international attention. By then, the international environment had shifted decisively. The United States had become Cuba's main commercial partner and saw the Caribbean as a strategic sphere. American policymakers and business interests watched Cuba's instability with a mix of anxiety and opportunity, while a sensational press turned the conflict into a moral drama of suffering and Spanish cruelty. Spain, weakened by domestic turmoil and lacking the naval strength of earlier centuries, faced a problem it could not localize. The Cuban War was no longer only about imperial authority. It was about how power in the Atlantic was changing hands. In early 1898, an American battleship, the USS Maine, exploded in Havana Harbor. The cause was uncertain, but the event became a catalyst. Public outrage in the United States, combined with sympathy for Cuban rebels and strategic calculation, pushed Washington toward intervention. Spain, unwilling to abandon Cuba yet unable to compel peace, entered a war for which it was poorly prepared. The Spanish-American War unfolded quickly and on multiple fronts. In the Caribbean, American naval power tightened the noose, and US forces landed in Cuba, coordinating in limited ways with Cuban insurgents who had already worn down Spanish control in the countryside. Spain's fleet, constrained by inferior ships and difficult choices, suffered decisive defeat. Puerto Rico, with fewer defences and less capacity to resist, was occupied with comparatively little fighting. In the Pacific, the American Navy struck the Spanish squadron in Manila Bay, shattering Spain's ability to defend the Philippines by sea. Filipino revolutionaries, already in revolt against Spain, pressed their own struggle as Spanish authority collapsed, only to confront the reality that the United States intended to replace Spain rather than recognize immediate independence. The settlement that followed stripped Spain of its last major overseas empire. Cuba became formally independent under heavy American influence and constraints, while Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory. Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States, a transfer that led directly into a new and brutal war between American forces and Filipino nationalists. For Spain, 1898 was not simply defeat. It was the end of an imperial identity that had lasted for centuries. The remaining fragments of empire could no longer justify the costs, and the world system that had once been organized around Spanish oceans now belonged to other powers. The losses of 1898 felt sudden, but Spain's imperial decline had been long in the making, built into the way the empire had grown. From the first Caribbean footholds to the great continental conquests, Spain became powerful quickly, and then spent that power just as quickly. The empire was vast, scattered, and expensive to defend. Silver and taxes could fund fleets and armies for a time, but war after war turned American treasure into European obligations. Costly commitments against the Dutch, against England in Italy and the Atlantic, made the monarchy dependent on borrowing, and repeated defaults weakened confidence and raised the price of survival. The deeper problem was economic structure. Extraction rewarded short-term inflows, not long-term development. The flood of bullion helped Spain purchase goods and pay soldiers, but it also encouraged dependence on imports and drained incentives to build a broad productive economy at home. In the colonies, systems like encomienda, forced labour drafts, and later debt peonage and plantation slavery concentrated land and power. Administration could be impressive, viceroys, audiencias, councils, and a paper-heavy bureaucracy, but distance, corruption, and competing jurisdictions limited what the crown could truly control. When reforms tightened oversight in the 18th century, they often raised revenue and resentment at the same time. Those inequalities mattered because they shaped colonial society for generations. A hierarchy of peninsulares, Creoles, mixed communities, indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans created permanent contests over status and rights. The Crown and the Church built towns, parishes, schools and courts, but they also defended privilege and demanded labour and tribute. By the time legitimacy cracked in 1808, grievances were already organised, not only against Spain, but against the local order Spain had helped create. Yet the empire also left institutions that endured. Spanish became a shared public language across much of the Americas. Roman law traditions, municipal government, and imperial courts influenced later constitutions and legal culture. Catholicism, carried by missionaries and enforced by the state, reshaped landscapes with churches, festivals, and moral authority, even as local beliefs persisted and blended. Cities built around plazas, councils, and cathedrals still anchor daily life, marking the urban imprint of empire. The human legacy was the most profound and most contested. Epidemic disease caused catastrophic indigenous population loss, a demographic collapse that made conquest possible and still haunts memory. At the same time, mestizaje, mixing of peoples, created new identities, families and cultures alongside enduring racism and struggles over land and recognition. Globally, Spain helped knit together an early modern world economy. American silver moved through Europe into Asia. The Manila galleons tied Mexico to the Philippines and China, linking markets, tastes, and fortunes across oceans. After 1898, Spain faced itself without empire. The shock fed debates over national purpose, reform, and decline, arguments that shaped modern politics and cultural life. What Spain left behind was not a single story of glory or ruin, but a vast uneven inheritance, languages and laws, cities and faiths, networks of trade and deep wounds, still visible wherever the empire once ruled.